Welcome to City and State TV. I'm Morgan Peckma. Today our guest is Rachel Fauss. She is the Director of Public Policy for the nonpartisan good government group Citizens Union. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, thanks.
So Citizens Union just released its annual voter guide. Can you talk about what that guide entails?
Sure. We've been actually doing voters directory since 1910, since we're a long-standing organization in the city. It's both a tool to inform voters about the choices they have on election day, but also to hold elected officials accountable once they're in office. We ask all candidates to fill out a questionnaire and list their responses on positions, whether they support or oppose our positions, and we use that as a tool to inform voters as well as, like I said, hold elected officials accountable once they're in office.
What were the key good government metrics that you questioned elected officials about this cycle?
Sure, we had actually 37 questions on our questionnaire, so very comprehensive. We looked at issues of election reform, campaign finance is a very big issue of ours, public matching is part of that, looking at the state budget and mechanisms to make it more transparent. Also looked at judicial reform, so merit selection of judges, and then a couple other topics like the Port Authority is a recent one, as well as the rules of the state legislature and how they can empower rank and file members. So those were some of the topics we looked at.
And is there to a certain degree that candidates have to conform with the positions of Citizens Union in order to win your preference? Is there like some sort of percentile breakdown, or is it relative to the other candidates in the race?
Sure, and I guess I'd first say that we send out our questionnaire to all candidates who are going to be on the primary election ballot, and then we prioritize competitive races. And for those races, we give every candidate the opportunity to interview with us. And once they interview with us, it's a 30-minute process, they also have to fill out the questionnaire. And our criteria is that the reform issues are the primary consideration, but also whether we think they're going to be an effective representative and be effective in moving a reform agenda once they're elected.
And you didn't weigh in on the Cuomo teach-out primary. There's obviously been a big dust-up around the Times decision to issue a non-endorsement. How come you stayed away from that race?
Well, we're a very small shop, and we were trying to prioritize the races in the state legislature, given that there are actually 8 seats in the state legislature that were open. That's a huge number for New York City, a number we haven't seen for a long time. So we focused our energy on those races, feeling that voters needed some more information about them.
Is there any degree of, the Times said in their non-endorsement that it was kind of a fait accompli that Governor Cuomo was going to be reelected. Is the likelihood of a candidate winning a factor in your decision to issue them as a preferred party or not?
Sure. Our criteria does look at viability, but it's not the primary consideration. The primary consideration is their commitment to a reform agenda. But that is one of the criteria among many that we look at.
Are there any races that you think, we have several indicted elected officials running for re-election. I presume that they didn't win your preference as a good government group.
No, they did not. So the 2 races where there's a sitting indicted legislator are Malcolm Smith in Senate District 14 in Queens. We preferred, and we use the term prefer rather than endorse, because we're a nonpartisan group. We reevaluate our decision for the general election, and then we call it an endorsement. But for the Malcolm Smith seat, we preferred Leroy Comrie, the current incumbent former city council member. We worked with him very closely on community board reform and other issues in the city council, and think he'll really be able to hit the ground running once he's in office.
And you're talking exclusively about New York City races, because there are other indicted elected officials in New York City.
That's very true, yes. As a city-based group, we only evaluate city races.
And you, at times, I know in the past, you've had multiple preferred candidates in the same race. Did that play out this way this year?
No, we preferred only one candidate in every seat, all the 15 races we did. It's been our decision that we think that voters have to make a choice, so our organization should as well. And getting back to the issue of indicted legislators, the other race we looked at was Senate District 19, where John Sampson is the current indicted incumbent. We preferred Del Smitherman in that seat, believing that as a union organizer, he would also be able to hit the ground running and be a very savvy advocate. And he was very good on reform issues as well.
It's interesting that you decided not to weigh in on the gubernatorial race, because that has revolved around good government issues, and Zephyr Teachout has made good government the kind of cornerstone of her campaign. In terms of educating the voters, wasn't it important to you to weigh in and see and to explain whether it really truly was a referendum on good government issues, the gubernatorial primary?
Well, first, I'd like to say we do plan to evaluate the race in the general election, so we will be bringing in the governor for an interview. We have another tool that we use to educate voters, and that's Gotham Gazette, which is our online publication, and it does provide information about every race going on in the city, and we do have some information about that, the governor's race, and they've been covering that issue as well. So we have the two facets of our organization, so the race was not left out entirely.
The Times said that they don't believe that the point of endorsements is to try to depose someone from office, re-elect them, but rather to help educate the voters. That seemed to me to run contrary to the spirit of endorsements. I mean, if you're issuing endorsements, you want this person to win because ostensibly that will be the best for the public good. What is your perspective on the aim of endorsing or preferring candidates as you classify it?
Sure. So, the voters do need to make decisions, and we want people to come out on election day and vote, and we also want them to be able to know where they stand on issues. So for us, it's really about looking at candidates and where they are on reform issues. And there are cases where we went against some incumbents this year. We went against Adriano Espaillat, preferring Robert Jackson, given Espaillat's record of missing 60% of votes this session. And we also preferred S.J. Jung against Dobie Savitsky. That district's changed demographically very much over the last decade, and S.J. Jung's also been a very important advocate for community engagement in Queens with the Minquan Center for Civic Action. So we have made some tough calls on some races and gone for a challenger in a couple of instances. Your
ratings in the past have been used by news gathering organizations as a way of kind of holding elected officials' feet to the fire, reviewing your questionnaires, and for instance, on their positions on Lulus, not accepting them in the city council. Are there any elected officials that, because of their failure to comply or to live up to their past promises in your questionnaires, that you decided to not go with them this year to hold them accountable for that?
We didn't actually have an instance of a person changing their position this year on an issue, but one thing that is kind of interesting in looking at our questionnaire is, and something that pops out a little bit, is we have a question about pension forfeiture. So as part of the ethics reforms a few years ago, legislators coming in after that date would potentially forfeit their pension if they were if they were convicted of a felony for items related to corruption. So we had many sitting legislators this year who didn't support that, one of them being Malcolm Smith, which was an interesting point. And we think questions like that and issues like that will be very interesting for the news media and general public to really look at, where do these elected officials stand on these issues? Is it their self-interest that's driving their position, or is it a broader public interest that we're looking at? And that's really the core of why we're evaluating candidates.
Yeah, I've been following your voter guide for many years, and I have to admit that sometimes I was befuddled by your decisions with who you've decided as preferred candidates. I felt like sometimes you went with a person who was more of a mainstream candidate as opposed to a person who was running as an insurgent on a good government platform. And I was wondering if, you look at, going back to the Times, I mean, the Times has issued some very embarrassing endorsements over the years in light of their long history. Of course, it was a reflection of their time. Do you ever look back at some of the candidates that you've preferred and been like, ooh, we really screwed up there?
Well, I think no organization is perfect, and we we do as much as we can to inform voters. And we do have a set of criteria that we have established. In the past, I think there wasn't as strict a criteria for the organization, but we've been making it a more professional operation. And something I would also add that I didn't mention previously is that we have a volunteer committee. We have 60 members of Citizens Union who commit their time on an unpaid basis, who come in and interview the candidates and take many summer evening hours to meet these candidates. So we have a very rigorous process that involves engaging with our members, making them part of the process. We have the questionnaire that is a tool that we use, and then we also have criteria that we evaluate candidates based on. So it is a very rigorous process.
Are there any races where you either didn't issue a preference or you worded it as such as like, we're kind of holding our nose and selecting this person because they're all bad choices?
Well, this year we feel very strong about all the candidates. I don't think there's a case of that this year.
Are there any other elements of the voter guide that might surprise our readers? For instance, to what degree how competitive are the races this year?
Sure, we have a new feature that we've added to our voter guide. It's called the Incumbent Index, no contest. And we found that in 2/3 of seats in New York City, there is an incumbent who's running uncontested. That's just an extremely high number that I think most people would be shocked to learn about. In the borough of Queens, for example, there in the assembly, out of 19 seats, only one incumbent is being challenged, Marge Markey. So that's an extremely high number, and people generally know that incumbents get reelected at large margins. But this is part of the reason. It's because in some cases voters have literally no choice of who to vote for, and we'll be looking at that again in the general election.
And what is the incumbent reelection rate right now?
As of from about 2004 to 2012, it was 96%,
and
that's statewide.
And what do you attribute the lack of challenges to?
Well, one of the key reform issues, actually, that we ask all the candidates about is campaign finance reform. In New York City, we have a public matching system where small contributions are matched in order to incentivize both, small donors having a larger role in the process, but also to now enable more candidates to be able to run. We don't have that at the state level. We did a report that I authored that looked at the difference between the New York City system and the New York State system and what that concretely meant for voters. So, for example, in primary elections, if there actually is one, usually only about 2 candidates will run, maybe an incumbent, maybe a challenger. In New York City, you'll get 5 candidates running for an open seat, 6, in some cases as many as 10 candidates trying to vie for that seat, whereas at the state level, you have far fewer choices that voters have. So that's, I think, one of the reasons is campaign finance reform, among many of the issues.
Did you ask the candidates to reflect at all upon the Moreland Commission and about the consequences of the commission?
Yes, we did. Ethics issues were of criteria that we looked at. I mentioned the issue of pension forfeiture. We also talked with candidates about the Moreland Commission. Universal disappointment in the process of the commission being shut down. But we also asked them to look at what would they do as a legislator, knowing that that was a governor-driven process. We asked them to look at the current Joint Commission on Public Ethics and the Legislative Ethics Commission and think of ideas of how to basically have the legislature do a better job of policing itself.
And is it the position of Citizens Union that the Moreland Commission or some new iteration of the Moreland Commission should be reconvened in order to continue to pursue the work of the body?
Well, we issued many statements at the time that it was shut down, that we didn't believe it should have been shut down. I think we'd have to look at what exactly a commission should look like if it's going to be reformed, because there are certainly some issues of the credibility of the Moreland Commission. So I think the public deserves to know that the next commission coming in is going to be operating on a basis where they're going to be able to make decisions and they're going to be able to follow the lead on stories and in their investigations.
How does your process differ for the primary from how you evaluate the general election?
There's really no difference. I mean, I think in New York City, the primary we tend to have a lot more Democratic races, by virtue of New York City being a high enrollment of Democrats. In the general election, we're going to get into more seats where we're going to be evaluating, obviously, a Republican and a Democrat. So that's really the only difference, but organizationally and process-wise, it's the same process.
What do you think will be the turnout in this primary? I mean, is there a sense that, I mean, we just see voter participation ebbing election after election. Is that a trend that you anticipate will continue?
Light turnout has typically been in the 20%. It's generally very low for primary elections. It's hard to predict exactly what it'll be this year. Maybe there will be a little more energy around some open seats, but I expect it'll probably be the same as previous years. There isn't a lot different that's going to be engaging voters to come out than there was in 2012. Or I'm sorry, in 2010 or 2012.
Have you seen an interest in all these open seats? I mean, other than news outlets like ourselves, I feel like those are pretty under the radar races.
Well, we held a candidate debate in Assembly District 76 on the Upper East Side, and we had a packed house. So that's, I think, an exciting sign that maybe in some cases voters will feel like they have a real choice. With all the open seats, all 8 of them, there really is more of there's an open slate for voters to make a choice. So hopefully that'll inspire a little more turnout, but if past races or past election years of any indication, it may not be enough to overcome that.
And it's a little down the road, but 2017 is when we have to weigh in on whether we want to reopen the books on a constitutional convention. Was that a question that you spoke to the candidates about this cycle?
It was not a question we looked at. We do believe that the constitutional convention process needs to be reformed. Currently, legislators are able to serve as delegates to the convention. We think that they shouldn't be able to be part of that process. So we'll be evaluating that issue in 2017, but presenting before that point some recommendations on how that process can be a better process.
And lastly, good government. As you know, I came from the good government movement like yourself. I mean, it's a very frustrating endeavor, and this has been a particularly good government has been in the limelight for good or for bad with all these problems swirling around Moreland. How is it that good government organizations can move beyond kind of the academic nature of your work and actually influence the public? I mean, how can we galvanize people around the issue of good government? Because it always kind of seems like it's this arcane, area that's separate from people's lives, and yet I'm sure that Goo-Goos like ourselves would argue that that is the actual core of the democratic process and should be the focal point of the voters, and yet that doesn't seem to gel in the minds of the people. How can we make good government a mainstream effort?
I think
in 20
it is true that with polling, you see that good government is not at the top. But on certain issues, it's really becoming more important. Campaign finance reform, public matching, those were terms that just were not known by the general public as much a few years ago. I think on that issue in particular with the Citizens United case, people are fed up with money in politics, and I think at least on the issue of campaign finance reform, the general public is getting more engaged about that, and that's going to be exciting coming into the next session when we see a new legislature come in, and one of our top priorities in Albany.
Also this year we're going to vote on the constitutional amendment surrounding districting. I wrote in my most recent column that voters should reject that amendment. I know Citizens Union feels contrary to the way that I do. I will agree to disagree with you. But are you going to be making any concerted effort to try to pass that referendum on Citizens Union's behalf?
Yes, we are going to be working on that campaign around the general election, since that's on the November 4th ballot. We have started a campaign, the Vote Yes for Progress campaign, jointly with the League of Women Voters. We think it's a unique opportunity for the voters to be able to take power back from the legislature. This is the type of question that hasn't come up in decades. Our groups like Citizens Union and the League have been fighting for redistricting reform for decades, and we finally have a rare opportunity for change. This commission will have no legislators sitting on it. And the voters voting on it will be able to take back some power. So it's a top priority of ours for this fall.
But because there's going to be an even number of representatives on the commission, and if it's deadlocked, it does return to the legislature. I mean, isn't that essentially what you were saying was the problem with the Constitutional Convention, is that it can still essentially be gamed or controlled by the legislature, and that kind of runs contrary to the spirit of independent redistricting, or at least what was the goal when New York Uprising and Citizens Union embarked upon the reform effort?
Sure. So the commission presents plans to the legislature, and the legislature has to take them up or down vote twice. Only if it's rejected on the third time can they amend it, and then they can only do so with 2% of the population of each district. And just to keep in mind, Iowa is nationally recognized as a redistricting model. This is the model in Iowa. The legislature in Iowa has never amended the plan on the third go. The PR issues that the legislature would face are very extreme. And at the same time, if there is disagreement, it would go to the courts. That's what we saw with the congressional lines last time in New York. So it's possible if there is that kind of gridlock, the courts will be the ones who would have to look at that issue.
To be fair, Iowa being a much more homogeneous state, it's a much more easy district to have. It's like little squares, right, when you break up Iowa. So it's a kind of comparing, to a degree, it's a very different scenario in New York City and New York State, isn't that correct?
Well, it is actually something that all the good government groups supported back in 2007, 2008, when we were drafting a bill with Mike Gianaris. It was based on the Iowa model. So I think, it has really been seen it as a national model. But you are right, New York is different. And because of that, the constitutional amendment actually has protections that put language in the Constitution for the first time about protecting minority voting rights, putting the pieces of the Voting Rights Act into the Constitution. Given the rollback of the Voting Rights Act at the federal level, we think that's a really important protection for minority communities in New York.
You talk about PR being a deterrent to bad behavior. I mean, with New York Uprising, you had Mayor Koch barnstorming across the state, calling legislators enemies of reform. I mean, certainly that was unprecedented for the amount of attention that it's gotten. And our legislators don't seem to be deterred in their bad behavior by bad press, as we see with the abundance of elected officials who are indicted and are involved in all sorts of, bad behavior. Do we really think that negative publicity is a deterrent for elected officials to act in a way that is other than self-serving?
Well, I guess I would first say that the legislature has to follow the constitutional requirements in amending the plan if it gets to that point, which we think it's unlikely that it will. And in that Constitution, for the first time, we're going to have a ban on partisan gerrymandering. So that's basically preventing legislators from favoring or opposing any incumbent, any challenger, any political party. In 2010, the voters in Florida put in a very similar provision, and the lines were challenged by the voters on those grounds. So there is a role for the voters. With that language in the Constitution, New York's voters are going to be able to sue. So say it did happen the way you suggested. Voters are going to be able to sue for the first time on that grounds. And in Florida, they were successful in getting forcing the legislature to look at that process again.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much.